box a little smaller here. And so basically this stream is going to be about the region of Syria that is, sorry, a little bit different than the rest of Syria. They basically have an ongoing revolution. So we're going to take a look at it. The first thing we're going to look at here is an excerpt from a longer documentary. But this is basically how their healthcare system works in Rojava. So we're going to look at this. It's very, very cool.
In Rojava, power is decentralized to the point where neighbors make most decisions that affect them in a body called a commune. This is nothing like a commune in the US. It is essentially a neighborhood assembly, made of 100 to 150 families or so, and instead of politicians deciding what norms should govern their community, they all do, through directly democratic structures. Each person living within the commune can represent themselves directly within the commune assembly. The commune is used on a principle that most of us know intrinsically. Nobody knows better what you and your neighbors need than you and your neighbors yourselves. Communes are linked together through elected and removable spokespersons, one woman and one man, to form a neighborhood council. And neighborhoods are linked to form city councils, and so on and so forth. This is a bottom-up or horizontal system of organizing society. The larger the area of administration a council has, the less power it has. For example, in the largest city in Jazeera Canton, Communes, there is a neighborhood called Corniche. In Corniche, there are 58 communes. Of these communes, 3 are Assyrian and Armenian, 3 Arabic, and 52 Arabic and Kurdish mixed. These 58 communes form the Corniche Neighborhood Assembly, but the heart of power remains in the individual communes themselves. Women and young people also can and do organize their own communes separately. The commune is made up.
And I mean, the point of this too, other than just learning about the place, I mean, it's an example of things that we can do. We can start to organize our neighborhoods. You know, you can get some things done through electoral politics sometimes, but even if you're able to enact redistributive policies and everything, which would be great, you still have the social barriers that need to be broken down. And really the only way of doing that is getting people to like talk to each other and like realize like their common humanity and everything, and empowering them as much as you can in their lives. So that's why, as they talk about in this video, nobody knows better what you and your neighbors need than you and your neighbors yourself. So if you and your neighborhood can take as much control back of your area that you're living in as possible, and then you can like confederalize it up with different organizations or whatever. But the point is you're slowly transforming and breaking down those systems that exist. Yes, it's a long process. Yes, it's not like, snap finger change and whatever, that you can, but it's lasting change once it's able to be built up, because there's a lot of things, like you can't solve everything simply by material needs or whatever, or by like a centralized structure at the top that solves material needs. I mean, material needs and class issues are definitely huge, huge problems. Huge. But they also have to be, you have to have an intersectionalist view where you take into account racism and sexism just as much as you do classism. And you have to figure out, how do I break these down completely. And really, I mean, just whoever it may be, and I know it's hard, but you have to show as much empathy and understanding where they come from and their background and why they think the way they do and whatever. And when you start to do that, you can try to find a way in that to try to break down whatever it is that you're trying to break down. You know, trying to break down their racism or their sexism or whatever kind of hatred and biases that they may have. So anyway, doing this in a communal, neighborhood-oriented way that keeps people involved with each other and gives people a feeling of meaning um, is very important.
Up of committees which residents can sign up for. To name a few, the Women's Committee, the Youth Committee, Healthcare Committee, Economic Committee, Safety Committee, Neighborhood Defense Groups, and Peace Committee. Transformative justice says the first line of defense. In order to really understand how communes work, we have to go through the committees one by one. As I said before, the more knowledge is concentrated into the minds of a few people, the more likelihood those people can create an oppressive power dynamic over those who depend on them. For those living in the communes, access to good health care is vital, especially in an area always under threat by hostile states and fundamentalist groups. In such a situation, it benefits no one for health knowledge to remain the domain of professionals. The people of Rojava see the dispersal of this knowledge as the reclamation of traditional knowledge that had once been passed down through women, but had been stolen from them by the state, guarded by powerful men, and sold back to the people for profit. As Haval Azad, a member of the Health Committee for Jazeera Canton, pointed out, the problem is that before the revolution, there was a deep connection between health and the power of the state. So we are building up a new system with a new basis, trying to remove this connection. Health is one of the key areas which is represented by specific structures and institutions in the new system. So the main aims for health in Rojava are 1. To solve the problem of relations between health and power, or the party. 2. To critique and rebuild the relationship between society and doctors. And 3. To return ownership of health to society. Everything is centered around self-organized committees, and if we organize around these committees, the state will disappear. So how is health, knowledge, and care decentralized at the commune level? As I said before, the goal is to decrease reliance on professionals whenever possible. To do this, each commune elects 2 heads of the health committee, 1 man, 1 woman, who are trained by doctors. These co-chairs then train every commune member who wants to learn in basic first aid and often even more advanced aid. This keeps valuable health knowledge from being centralized and allows life-saving action to be dispersed. The communal healthcare model seeks to combine the latest in medical technology and research with traditional natural medicine without discounting the value of either. In April of this year, Halanj, village near Kobani, was reported to have achieved medical autonomy through their self-organization in communes. 4 of the communes in the village, together part of the House of Communes, established a medical center for themselves and the surrounding area. The villagers chipped in what they could to buy pressure gauges, sugar testers, and other medical tools such as sterilizers and syringes to be stored in the village medical center. The role of natural medicine is encouraged by education so people can learn about their own bodies, and some communes are even coordinating excursions for gathering herbs to start to get back the wealth of the local knowledge that 5,000 years of state and patriarchal systems have attempted to destroy. From Kandil, a region in Iraq where Kurds have formed some autonomous villages, also under democratic confederalism, we have the example of the village of Binar, where residents volunteer to plant and harvest the sumac herb together, taking what they need for themselves and distributing the rest to relatives and neighbors. A resident, Amin Mehamed, told a journalist, "Sumac contains many healthy features. It is also used as a medicine for many health issues. It is effective against high blood pressure, it strengthens the gums, and is very beneficial for children as well. but it should be enjoyed only in healthy moderation and not in abundance. It is also deemed a medicinal herb. It grows in almost the entire region, and it is also effective against diabetes. An important aspect that cannot be overlooked is women's health needs and the way in which women are organizing to meet them. Again, we can turn to Haval Azad. The point is to give people education, at the commune level, so that they can have the knowledge and decide for themselves. In this education, people are made to think about, for example, the consequences of having many children if you do not have any money, and what the future might be like for your children. People are thus given the chance to decide for themselves how many children they want to have. Women can use this knowledge how they would like and have easy access to birth control. The last crucial piece of the health committee is prevention of illness in the first place. Haval Azad noted how states spend tons of money on treating illnesses but don't put the same resources into prevention. I'll close this section with her words. The state system looks at society as if it is sick and needs to be cured, but it is the system itself that is the illness of society.
Next one we're gonna go with David Graeber. Um, if you don't know who David Graeber is, he is an incredible author, anarchist, um, and anthropologist. And he wrote some incredible books. One is called Debt. Um, it's a history of debt and everything, and it's incredibly well written. And he also wrote Bullshit Jobs, which is about how a lot of jobs, are pretty bullshit. That really don't need to be done. All kinds of office jobs and all kinds of nonsensical tasks like, health insurance companies or, any of those kind of um, bureaucratic, nonsensical things like that. Okay, so let's go with this. Um, and just, also rest in power, David Graeber, because he died, I think, less than a year ago or about a year ago. Sad. And also rest in power, Michael Brooks, who died today, last year. Um, which actually, I try to watch a Michael Brooks video, one that I liked about reclaiming the local that he made in um, April of 2020. So, we'll watch that after this David Graeber video. Okay.
I was in Syria once. I was in southern Turkey. I was in Iraq. I was in, a variety of different areas within the Kurdish territories that are experimenting with direct democracy. And
Can you tell me a little bit about what brought you there, and certainly from the very beginning?
it was less that I found them than that they found me. There's people involved in the Kurdish freedom movement it started, or it emerged in the PKK, which is a rather conventional Marxist-Leninist, guerrilla group in its origins. But something about its history took it in this radically new direction. A lot of it was internal processes of women guerrillas sort of asserting themselves and introducing feminism as a big theme. Part of it had to do with the particular intellectual evolution of their leader, Öcalan, who's become this, since his arrest and imprisonment in this like island prison in
Free Ocean.
Turkey, has been reading a lot of Murray Bookchin and a lot of feminist theory, and yeah, came around to a much more anarchist position. Basically, they decided that rather than demanding a state of their own, they wish to simply make borders irrelevant and dissolve away states entirely. And it's kind of made sense to people in that part of the world. Remember, the Kurds are a population who are divided between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. The idea of their somehow carving a government out of that seems unlikely, and they also make the rather common point you hear a lot of, actually. People say, well, we come to realize in this part of the world, demanding your own country is basically the same as saying, I demand the right to be tortured by secret policemen speaking my own language. It's not much of a demand. So they've come around to this idea of bottom-up direct democracy and sort of eliminating borders is the best way that they could come up with something like a Kurdistan that would make sense.
So the place is there? Can I even say the place is there? I mean, there is a physical place that you
Kurdistan.
went to.
Oh, I went to Rojava. Rojava is, or West Kurdistan, is the Syrian part of Kurdistan. It's a large section of northern Syria along the Turkish border. And about 2 million people there engaged in what I think considered to be one of the great historical experiments. My father fought in the Spanish Civil War, so I kind of grew up in a place where the memories of what happened in Spain in 36, 37, 38, were very vivid. And so one reason I came to be an anarchist is because
They're a group
I
of
always say
Americans
most
who went
people
up into,
don't think
like,
anarchism is a bad idea. They
against
think it's
fascism
insane, right? I mean,
in favor of
really, no police, people just start killing each other.
was,
Nobody could actually organize
basically
things without leaders.
separation
And in fact, my father was in
secrecy
Barcelona when it was run on anarchist principles. They just got rid of white collar workers, and
stuff.
sure enough, they discovered these were basically bullshit jobs that they didn't make any difference if they weren't there. So having grown up like that, I understand that it's possible, but there hasn't been an experiment on that scale, like what happened in Spain in the Republican-controlled, especially anarchist-controlled areas, since, because everybody's so terrified, and people running things, like they don't mind if people say, I hate you, I want to overthrow you, nearly so much as they say, you guys are ridiculous and unnecessary. That's what they really fear. So, the enemies they like are the ones who try to replace them. Marxists basically, the Marxists come, the police will still be there, and probably there'll be more of them, right? Anarchists come, the whole structures will be changed. People will be told they're just completely unnecessary. And so that kind of experiment they're really afraid of. They tend to stamp it out as quickly as possible. So this is the first time, I think, since Spain that you've had a large area of territory under the control of people who are trying to do that, trying to create bottom-up direct democracy without a state.
Where else has that been tried?
Well, I mean, it's tried everywhere in the world for much of human history and worked fine. But under, modern industrial conditions, there have been various attempts. In most revolutionary history, they talk about the Paris Commune, they talk about Kronstadt, they talk about Makhno in Ukraine. There have been attempts to do so, but usually everybody of all sides, including the left-wingers, turn on them and try to suppress it.
Okay, and so what are the basic minimum things that they have to organize in, or the success
Well, they
of
run in
organizing
cities.
Rojava?
It's a real, country of real economy. It's a poor one, and they're under embargo.
They don't actually.
But there are people driving cars. There's traffic rules. There's workshops and factories producing things. There's farms. There's all the things you have in a normal society. Roads have to be maintained, but essentially, what they have done is created. Very interesting. I've described it as a dual power situation, but it's the first time in human history, I think, where you have a dual power situation where the same guy set up both sides. So they have a thing that looks like a government. It's got a parliament. It's got like ministers. They pass legislation, but they also have the bottom-up structures. The bottom-up structures is what they call democratic confederalism. Every neighborhood has an assembly. And every assembly has working groups. There are people who handle health issues and medical issues and security issues. And each one of those groups, each assembly and each working group also has a women's group. They have to have 40% women or they don't have a quorum, but they also have an all-women's group that can veto anything they say. So it has to be, everything is gender balanced. All officials, there's two, one male, one female of everything. Also, the army's like that. That's why they have all those famous images of the women with weapons. But that's political, too. People said very explicitly, they said, well, look, we're anti-capitalist. We've always been anti-capitalist. But, I think they say the lesson of history, we feel, is that you can't get rid of capitalism without getting rid of the state. And you can't get rid of the state without getting rid of patriarchy.
True.
Well, how do you get rid of patriarchy? Well, making sure all women have access to automatic weapons is one place to start. You really can't push people around if they're armed. All right, so And they have their women's police forces too. That like, so they have direct democracy, and it goes from these neighborhood councils, and those councils confederate into like regional ones and then municipal ones, and they all send delegates, not representatives, to make decisions together. They have a very elaborate system. But the key is, you have this top-down system, you have a bottom-up structure. Well, what they say is this isn't a state because anybody with a gun is answerable to the bottom-up structures and not the top-down.
I see.
Yeah. So the people in the top can't actually force anybody to do something they don't want to do.
Right.
There's one exception, and that's women's rights. So they have they'll have laws like abolishing child marriage or something like that. And they say some of these villages would probably reinstate it if we let them. But that's off limits. And they do have an enforcement mechanism, but that's an all-women police force that enforces rules specifically relevant to women.
How long have you been going with these?
3 or 4 years now.
And what was the inspiration? Was this the gentleman that you said in the prison?
Öcalan, yes, Abdullah Öcalan. His picture is everywhere. It's interesting because, generally speaking, they very much shun a cult of personality. Like, in fact, they never have images of anybody who's alive except for him. They have pictures of people who are dead. So there's pictures of martyrs everywhere from the wars. But they'll never show an image of someone who's still around because that would be anti-democratic.
Yeah.
Making someone out to be a charismatic leader.
like-
He's the exception. But that's because he's in prison for the rest of his life. So he's the leader, and everybody accepts him as such. But the thing is, Turkey was going to execute him, but they they still wanted to get into the EU at that point, so they knew they couldn't do it. And according to law, he could put any testimony relevant to his crime. He had the right to write it all down. So he decided that in order to explain and contextualize the crimes he's accused of, he would have to write 12 different books, including a 3-volume history of the Middle East, and so forth. So this work has been coming out continually and is used as a sort of grounding for debates within the Kurdish movement. And he made all these declarations. We need to get away from purely class struggle model and understand that the oppression of women is the most primordial and immediate thing we have to deal with. We have to understand that ecology is equally important to exploitation. So they've become this sort of ecological feminist army based on principles of direct democracy.
Are his works available in English?
Oh, yeah. Not all of them, obviously, but there's volumes coming out continually. And, just from an anarchist point of view, to some degree, it is a little creepy. You go there, and there are all these pictures of the great leader. And I came to refer to him as Uncle Oj. Like Uncle Joe backwards. But, he's the opposite, because he's like the authoritarian leader telling everybody to read anarchism and stop being authoritarian. Okay. And it puts the old-fashioned authoritarians in a terrible bind, right? Because, they have to do everything the leader says. The leader's saying, think for yourself. They're like, well, okay. Yeah. And obviously the young people are very enthusiastic. So, they're not anarchists, but they embrace a lot of anarchist ideas. They've been reading anarchism. They're anti-state, so what they call themselves really doesn't matter from an anarchist position as long as you're anti-state and anti-capitalism.
How do they protect the territory?
Well, they believe in the notion of defense. Well, the thing is, they're the best fighters in Syria.
What's the difference between state and what they're doing? Because they've got their territory, so surely
it's protect society. They say that the argument they have.
Isn't that a semantic difference, though?
Well, they think not, because what they would say is that a state is a monopoly of legitimate use of coercive force in a territory. They don't have such a monopoly. It's a democratic bottom-up organization. There is no institution that can do that. So they say, well, any institution has to defend itself. Anything in nature has to defend itself. Defense is but it's waging aggressive war, attacking that. So their army is called the People's Defense Units. And it's also democratic. They elect their leaders. They, every night they discuss the decisions and critique them and can remove them. And so it's all very much an experiment in democracy. And you'd think this is great. Well, as soon as they meet a real army, let's see what happens. Well, they always win. They've been completely defeating ISIS systematically on the ground, and at the moment they're marching on the ISIS capital.
So we've all got each other's back. That's the vibe, yeah? That's the idea. And sorry, you said they're marching on
Raqqa. America is in the ironic position of having to back a bunch of anarchists because they're the only people who are good military fighters in the region who are actually trying to take out the fascists.
And
I thought it was quite strange on my way here. I thought I might be asking
consensus
David
systems are
about project
a
management,
lot.
but
Yeah.
given your work on bureaucracy and bullshit jobs, but in a way, these people are kind of exemplifying good project management, are they not?
Oh yeah, they're doing. Yeah, I mean, people misunderstand. They think that like people who are against
Other
that anarchists are against all forms of anything that even looks like a bureaucracy, any form of administration, any form of management, any form
socialization,
of organization, even. This is, I
so
mean, I'm sure
things
there are some individuals like
like
that, but
housing and
as Malatesta used to point out, if you say that anarchists are crazy people who are just against everything, all people who are crazy people who are just against everything will start to call themselves anarchists. That doesn't actually mean much about what the other ones,
critique,
who are always calling themselves anarchists, will say.
and you need
In
Sorry,
that sense,
small
anarchism isn't against organization.
like
It means people don't have to be
vote for this
compelled to
part,
organize
but like
themselves.
sure,
In fact, they
just
believe in organization more than anybody else.
specific
Okay, because actually, the thing that I was wondering was,
like
what are your
try to
your
break
bits
down
of
these
your tidbits on
so
your tips
like
on project management?
Oh, I see. Yes.
things off
Well, I think that
threats.
accountability is
There'd be
key.
yeah,
If
I
you
think
have
a
a
lot of
system where anybody
separates
can
need to
say what
have
they want,
like cement.
you'll have to come up and nobody can be compelled to do something that's obviously stupid. You're going to have to make it a commonsensical. For example, consensus process. Everybody talks about it as if it's a complex set of rules, like Robert's Rules of Order, and they say it's oppressive. But they're doing it wrong. The idea is that nobody should be forced to do something that they violently object to. If you don't have the means to do so, whatever you do will be consensus, because you're going to have to listen to what everybody thinks.
As possible.
And you're going to have to, come around to a position that nobody finds violently objectionable, which is basically all consensus is.
But what happens when people say we don't have enough time to listen to everybody?
And you would be
Well, then it depends on the situation. If something has to be done, then it is okay to say, all right, for the next 3 hours, she's in charge. There's nothing wrong with that if everybody agrees to it. Or you improvise, but the consensus is like the default mode. And all I believe in is taking that basic principle that if you can't force people to do things that they don't want to do or they think is absolutely wrong or idiotic, then you're going to have to develop a structure of hearing people out. That's the only thing I wouldn't compromise on. Everything else is like, what's the most effective way to do that? For example, in Kurdistan, they actually came up with a very interesting creative solution to this. They say that they make a distinction between technical matters and moral or political matters. So they say if it's a technical thing, you can do a majority vote. Are we going to meet at 4 or are we going to meet at 5? Then sure, show of hands. If it's like, should we be violent or nonviolent? Well, then you have to have consensus.
Okay.
Then, of course, obviously the question is who gets to decide what's a moral question and what's the technical one. So somebody might say, well, the question of 4 or 5 bears on disabled people, and that's a moral question, and so that becomes a little bit of a political football. There's always things to debate and points of tension, but nonetheless, you can be efficient when you have to, but you're efficient with the things that efficiency is more important than what is at stake.
Okay. I once asked you about bureaucracy in activist circles.
Yeah.
Had you ever seen it? And you told me that you could possibly talk about that forever, but if you could just...
Yeah, I think that's
tell me
exactly
about
what I'm talking about now. People who don't understand that these are a set of principles around which one can improvise and find the thing which is best for a particular group of people and a particular thing they're trying to do will tend to act like everything is a set of rules that you have to obey. And it's so frustrating to me. I often have people within Occupy were convinced that I was the guy demanding that, there's a rule book of consensus, because I'm for consensus. I'm not for absolute consensus, modified consensus. There always has to be something to do. There's always be 1 or 2 people who are crazy or unreasonable or something. So, everything within reason, including reasonableness. But But nonetheless, there'll be some people thinking I'm the rulebook guy and other people saying I'm the crazy anarchist rip up all the rules guy, which maybe that shows I'm hitting the right point in the middle. But, yes, there is a tendency for creeping bureaucratization to set in, and there's various reasons for that. I've actually, one of the things I was interested in looking at in the book is why that happens. Language is a great example of this. First, on the one hand, languages are always changing. There's no language on Earth that's the same as it was 100 years ago. Why is that? Well, people like to play around. Everybody's always like doing it a little different. They're having fun with it a little, and gradually, things, it doesn't matter if you're in Sweden or New Guinea or Ecuador or any place else. So people like to have fun. They'll play around with the language. But on the other hand, if you tell people they're doing it wrong, they'll believe you. So if you take a rule book, for how language was in 1910 and say, look, you've corrupted the language, they'll say, oh my God, you're right. Teach us how to speak right. They'll all use slang and slack off and, come up with funny new ways of talking. And then they'll believe you if you say that they shouldn't be doing that. And in a way, this is the fundamental dilemma that makes bureaucracy possible.
So you mean, for example, language is something which happens to have rules. And
Right.
if somebody comes in and says there's
But the rules are changing all the time.
Right. Do you think that we just like being dominated?
I don't know if that's it. I mean, some people obviously do. Sometimes it's laziness. They just don't want to have the responsibility of having to decide things all the time. One of the reasons we like being dominated is because that way we can blame somebody else if something goes wrong. There's a certain, heavy weight of responsibility when I constantly have to be, part of the person making the decision. I mean, in a way, the aspects of power that are pleasurable are, balanced by the aspects of power which are scary. And some people definitely it's worth the risk, and enjoy the pleasurable parts a lot more than they're scared by the scary parts. And other people are the other way, and that's one thing that allows power to emerge. I mean, I feel very strongly, by the way, that compulsory participation in direct democracy is just as wrong as not allowing people to, participate. In any example of successful long-term democracy I know, some people don't show up. There's usually actually a core of maybe about a third of the people, like in a kibbutz or something like that, who just they're the process junkies, they're the political guys, and but they're acting in the knowledge that if they do something people don't like, those people will show up at the next meeting, whether no matter how lazy they've been up till now. So in a way, they have to bear everybody else's interests in mind because they don't have the right to represent them.
My. Okay, that was really good. But music. Okay. Now, that's right. We're gonna check out that Michael Brooks video. So, let me get that. First of all, let's go back. Let's see, is this it? Yeah, here we go. Got an ad coming up here. Yep.
Here's something cool. I'd love to.
All right, so in memorial of the 1 year passing of Michael Brooks, we are going to watch this video from April 12th of last year. It's really good, and I think it kind of goes in line with the whole Rojava thing of organizing locally in neighborhood assemblies and food and everything like that. Growing as much food as you can locally, making them permaculture for it, make it permaculture so that they'll grow back every year and whatever, and you can basically eventually reach self-sustaining forests and whatever. Okay.
But first, I want to talk about the need for localism and how the localism movement, a localist, resilient politics can fit into a project that synchronizes planetary solidarity, empathy, global interdependence, the basic demands of national social democracies delivering healthcare, housing, and other absolute necessities for all citizens, and also a empowered local politics that can help generate independence and safety for vital systems, food, medical supplies, energy, and more. The coronavirus has destroyed our illusions about the safety and the desirability of abstracted global supply chains. Let's look at what's happened over the past several weeks in particular, including a report from Reuters on disrupted global food chains in India. Limitations of travel
About a month
have
pandemic.
led to massive waste. Dairy farmers are being forced to dump milk. Planting windows are being missed, and the shortage of labor means that many crops are likely to rot and remain unpicked. This could lead and will lead to food shortages. It will damage labor prospects, and as always, threaten the livelihoods and well-being of already pressed small farmers who are already sort of
Yep. And with climate change this year, I mean, you got the Midwest under drought and everything, and farmers not being able to have enough water for whole fields of their crops. Um, and same with water shortages in California and Arizona. There's huge amounts of produce that come from those areas. So um, the need to have local food security like this is incredibly important, and it's just going to become more important. And also to have a access to help people if they need it too. So um, setting up as many local support systems as possible and making those systems directly democratic, where no one person has a whole bunch of power and everybody can feel empowered by having that directly democratic system. It's, it's very important, and I think it's increasingly important.
threatened, not sort of, deeply threatened by agricultural monopolies and governmental policies that do not favor them. The problem isn't limited to food either. There, we see in the United States the lack of essential resources in terms of medical supplies, medicine, and other areas in which the United States has no national, a very limited national and local capacity to produce what it needs. This all goes back to decades of corporate written trade policies that have sought to undermine national independence, cheapen labor, destroy labor unions, and IMF and World Bank packages that have demanded that developing countries not create any self-sustaining industries of their own in either key national strategic areas or in local communities and in areas of expertise such as agriculture. Across the globe, the pursuit of cash crop uses up the best land for export while locals are malnourished. And we are seeing, of course, as I say again, the devastating cost of our inability to produce our own medical supplies in the United States, thanks to trade agreements like PNTR with China that was passed in the late 1990s. Now, we need to reprioritize the local in this. Of course, I'll keep emphasizing there's a profoundly important, urgent role and necessity of recognizing that we are globally interdependent, that there's no Chinese virus, there's no African virus, there's no American virus. This sort of garbage xenophobic thinking is antithetical to the shared endeavor of trying to protect humanity through collective scientific efforts, medical innovation, coordination, and extraordinary acts of solidarity like Cuba's doctors. Nation states have the responsibility to provide every single person in their polity healthcare, housing, clean water, food, and more. Obviously, the United States is so devastated and so behind in all of these vital areas. But now we also need to reprioritize a notion of localism that is empowered and democratic. Renegade thinkers in the 1970s, like E.F. Schumacher and Ivan Illich, emphasized human-centered systems and critiqued bureaucracies, both public and private, that took away capacity building in agriculture and education and replaced it with standardized and mass process. It was a critique not of the notion of development entirely, but of the idea of bringing in top-down structures that robbed people of local agency and said that people's innate capacities, traditional systems, lacked any value and can be destroyed by the march of capital and bureaucratic development. In a contemporary world, we have Michelle Bowens at the Peer-to-Peer Foundation and people like Jeremy Johnson, who's been on this show, and Brent Cooper, and people involved in something called the meta-modern movement. Now, I don't agree with all of the ideas in this movement, but I do know that there's some very, very, very important things they're exploring, including recentering the idea of the commons. Of course, Marx talked about the enclosure of the commons. We've done a history of that with Richard Wolff. The notion of broad public expanses of land which had to be commodified and made private in order for the formation of modern capitalism. Common resources cover a huge amount of area of human value, ecological, technological, and artistic, that exist inside and outside of markets as well as government. They really are their own sort of third sector platform. And there's a huge amount that can be done in a local level to reclaim the commons and create more resiliency. Things like community-supported agriculture, people working in common agricultural collectives, initiatives to reassert the need for municipally owned and locally distributed energy sources, building more capacity locally. This can also fit with the more technological focus of folks like Aaron Bastani. As an example, if we use 3D printing in a effective and smart way, it could immediately change the paradigm of medical production, drug production, and other vital areas, and again, create that local capacity building. This, and we'll see this actually in some of the success of Kerala later, also cannot be separated from a fundamentally democratic ethos. We're not talking about simply local capitalism. We're not talking about making micro exploitation. We're talking about the role of localism in a broader democratization and empowerment of the economy. And this is also a very important way of looking at it from a Marxist perspective, that when we understand that, of course, there's a fundamental need for government, regulation, and things like that in our modern circumstances. There's no way of getting around that. But that the ultimate aim of this politics is emancipatory and empowering in the broadest sense. And that's going to include people organizing in their polities and taking control of their regional networks to generate more democratic outcome. Capitalism tends towards monopoly systemically. There's a reason why local production has been replaced by global production and profit seeking. However, we can recognize that while capitalism disempowers us from taking important decisions, that our lack of local planning and inability to produce locally comes from the dominance of major corporations and unnecessarily complex systems whose only goal is profit. We need to be talking about using local social and political movements to rebuild our capacities for production and connect those industries and systems to broader global efforts to reorient the economy. Every site is a site of struggle, and we need a local movements as much as we need national and international ones. It's not either or. We need to fight on every battlefield, and the local has been neglected for far too long. Again, global interdependence, national social democracy, and local resilience with a through line of, in the fullest sense of both words, democratic socialism girding all of these movements. Does that make sense, guys? Do you guys have anything you want to add to that?
I just wanted to highlight something that's very important, that people understand, that when we're talking about localism, that not to fetishize, for example, small versus large, rather to focus on community power, democratic control over the control of the few. So, when we're talking about, for example, how ridiculous our food system is, where there's large places across, for example, like the Horn of Africa, where people are malnourished, living right next to very, very good soil, because that land is being used to produce cash crops that are exported, right? And it's about taking back control over like the regions around us so that we can better provide for ourselves and provide for communities instead of just for profit seeking. So when we're talking about, and also just the kind of anarchic world that we're living in today, where there's actually a very few amount of suppliers that supply major cities like New York City, all across the country. Our food systems are controlled by a few major corporations, and there's no reason that we should not have more local agriculture. So it's not about fetishizing small versus large. It's about saying that we need more democratic control over our society and over our economy, and reclaiming the local that has been completely devastated by global capitalism is a massive and very crucial first step.
Yes. And also, Matt, I mean, and also it is very important. And as I'm kind of digging back into this literature, again, particularly Small is Beautiful and E.F. Schumacher's work on books like Deschooling Society, which I'll talk about more, there's flaws in these models. There's no doubt about it, there's flaws in every model, but there is actually something very important, I think, about also reasserting the idea that when these modes of production came in and completely wiped away old systems, that basically saying, as an example, I'll make it, concrete, that like the work on the commons, everybody should think of this essay called The Tragedy of the Commons by Garrett Hardin, which is one of the worst pieces of writing ever, right?
Oh, true.
And the notion, it was a piece in the late 60s, was that if the commons are not regulated by a private market, they will be despoiled. They will be destroyed. And it's a really interesting move, because what you're discounting, and again, I understand that some people, this is not about romanticizing local production or First Nations people or anything like that. Every society is flawed. Everything has problems. But it is very significant when you realize that both from the perspective of private capital, but also a lot of efforts of like eco-preservation has been built on an assumption that, oh, this group doesn't know how to manage its own resources. Let's get in and control it for them. Whether it's because we're doing something like, we see like bioprospecting. You were talking about Africa earlier. Countries like Saudi going into Africa and pre-buying plots of land and trying to have access to food and water and things like that for when they run out of things, right? But also, we see this in a lot of controversies around like eco-preservation that don't have legitimate partnerships with local partners, essentially. So my point is that these frameworks also help recognize that there is something very damaging about completely delegitimizing multiple systems of agriculture, as an example, multiple systems of how to govern the commons. And while not romanticizing, we have to recognize that this broader capitalist project is also synchronized with homogenizing how we do everything. And one of the benefits of a healthy localism is that there is sort of an innate diversity of production and ideas, because you're decentralizing certain things enough, where that can happen. And I think that does need to happen in things like food, agriculture, energy, and elsewhere. And the really exciting thing now is that it can be synchronized with technical innovation as well. If you actually use 3D printing in an effective way, that could actually be a significant change in pharmaceutical production, as an example.
Just real quick, I agree with you completely, especially the homogenization and what happens with that. Like there's a project in South Carolina called Anson Mills, where they're actually trying to revive a lot of the old rices and the old beans and the old flours and all the old crops that have been completely devastated by a monoculture, where we're growing the same kind of rice all around the world, and it's destroying indigenous and more ancient and more diverse versions of food stuff. So like there's a lot of people who are doing that work, and it has to cut across against the market, because that's not the most profitable way to operate. But if we're making conscientious efforts, we can preserve those and and expand and have a more interesting and healthier food supply. I think that's exactly the kind of way that we need to be thinking about it. We should be involved in the decision. Do we want to live in a society where all the rice is the same kind of variety across the world? No, we want to have a more options and healthier rice, all these different things. I mean, these are the kind of decisions that we're just left out of. It's fundamentally, it's a question of democracy.
Yeah.
It's funny. I know I've been on my colonial studies kick, and you look at just the original dispossession sort of rationales, which is you aren't improving the land, Native Americans, so we're going to take better advantage of it.
Mm-hmm.
But, we're having this issue of like the short-term horizon of corporations and the profit motive. Well, back then it was the same case where it's like, if you look at it over the course of like 20 years, because they didn't exhaust the land and like the nutrients inside it, they rotated it in a much smarter way. It was actually way more profitable in the long term than, the immediate just get every little bit of potassium out of it.
Look what cotton did to the South.
Right.
And these examples are still really like these are still playing out today in monocultures and things like that, which have enormous ecological consequences, but are also really, really damaging to farmers, as an example. Globally. I want to also, I'll hat tip also Vandana Shiva's work here is important with this. You just watched a